Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to the final episode of season 3 of the Historians Lounge. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Maybe you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us is an historian making their official return back here on the show. Now, many of you may remember this guest. She completed her PhD and MA in art history at the University of Haifa in Israel and has a BA in classics from Temple University in Philadelphia. And in her debut interview on the channel, we discuss her book, Crown of Thorns, which focuses on Jesus' crown of thorns, which has become one of the most ubiquitous symbols in Christian art. And in this episode, viewers and listeners, we are going to be following up that interview by talking about the last chapter in I guess book. And without further ado, I am so greatly happy to have this guest come back here on the show for the final episode of the Historians Lounge season 3. Without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our returning guest, Dr. Faith Tibble. Faith, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Gabriel. What an introduction. That's very kind.
Awesome, Faith. Awesome. So excited to have you back here on the show. Before we go into today's episode, we'd like to share with the viewers and listeners as a little update of what you've been up to since the last time you were on the show.
Well, gosh, I mean, I think you're one of my first interviewers right after the book came out. So I've been busily promoting the book. I've been doing lots of talks all over the UK and not really abroad, but some international podcasts. So that's always fun too, as with you. And
Nice.
so it's just been a fun ride, really. And now starting to settle down for the holidays.
That's awesome. That is awesome to hear, Faith. Now, for our viewers who are now just meeting you for the first time, if they haven't
Mm.
seen your interview, which I had a chance to look back, the first time you were here on the show was in March. So it was earlier in the
Wow.
year. So it's been quite a few months. So for those just now meeting you for the first time, Dr. Faith Tibble, would like to share with the viewers and listeners your book and what people can expect from it.
Absolutely. So my book is The Crown of Thorns, Humble Gods and Humiliated Kings. And it basically looks at the Crown of Thorns in art from when it first appears in art in the mid 4th century, so late antiquity and Roman art, until it becomes something that you and I might recognize today. So the
Mm,
book really tracks the Crown of Thorns from, late antiquity, early medieval. And what was interesting about this book and studying it, because I think when a lot of people hear the Crown of Thorns, they think of it as this, horrible, piercing thorns into the bloodied brow of Christ. But actually, that image took a long time, much longer than pretty much anything else that you would associate with Jesus, to come into art. So my book is about why that happens and why it looks like nothing you would expect in earliest art. It's a leafy wreath when we first encounter it in art, rather than those sharp, cruel thorns that you would expect. So the book looks at why. The book looks at how it changed and why it took so long. So if you like the Romans, if you like first century Judea, it's got that. If you like very early medieval, it's got that. If you like martyrs, if you like kingship, it's got a lot in there. So I would, if you're interested in any of those things, in theology or art or history or medieval history, I would take a look.
nice. And in this episode, viewers and listeners, as I mentioned in the introduction, we'll be talking about the last chapter in Dr. Faith Tibble's book. Now, Faith, without spoiling too much to give it away, what ultimately is the final chapter of your book about?
Yeah, so my publisher TNT Clark, who are fantastic, they made the very good point when I handed them my manuscript. They said, "You need a follow-up, almost like this podcast. You need to tell us, where are we now with the Crown of Thorns? You know, it's all well and good telling us that our idea of the Crown of Thorns is actually very, very recent and potentially wrong, right? It's all well and good
Right.
saying that, but we need a chapter telling us, where are we now? What does it mean now to a modern audience? And has it changed drastically over broad media? I mean, of course, I was pretty limited in my wording, so I had to be good and concise writer. But it was actually a really fun chapter to do. So the TNT Clark was absolutely right. They made a very good point. And I think it was a really fun chapter, and I've been told it's a fun chapter to read.
Nice. Very, very nice. So let's just dive right into the discussion for today. So, as you mentioned earlier, Faith, that the Crown of Thorns, as we know it today, is a more recent phenomenon, generally speaking. That initially in art depictions and so forth, it actually was more of a wreath crown before. But
That's right.
recently, but recently, it did transition into what we know as the Crown of Thorns, and it has been cemented in the human psyche in every depiction, every media, every docudrama, that the Crown
Mhm.
of Thorns is this spiky, prickly, very dangerous headgear, and we've just come to believe that that is exactly what was used initially. But as you mentioned in your first interview, that wasn't initially the case. So, almost as a recap, where does the transition begin from the wreath crown to this very, very dangerous, prickly crown?
Yeah, the transition really starts to take place again pretty late for Passion iconography, or imagery that relates from Jesus's time leading up to his death, right? It really starts to happen in the late 11th century and into the 12th century, that we start to see thorns, that we start to see the crown depicted at all, that we start to see the mockery, or when the crown was made, come together with the crown itself. So we see examples of mockery earlier in Christian art, but it takes a long time for the crown to be included. So you're really looking at the late 11th, early 12th century. And the person who puts the Crown of Thorns as we know it on the map was King Louis IX of France. Right, so he
Hmm,
brought the relic back with him. He bought it from. He's not a great crusader, but he was very pious and very wealthy, and so he bought a bunch of relics while he was over in Constantinople. And from Baldwin II of Constantinople, he bought the Crown of Thorns, among other things, and brought it back to Paris, which, by then, the Holy Land was sort of being lost quite dramatically, and Paris was, in his eye, sort of the new Jerusalem, right? So what
right.
better place to store relics than Paris? And so he takes the Crown of Thorns and he arrives in Paris. And this is what's interesting about him, is that the king, he takes off his royal robes, he takes off his royal crown, he takes off his shoes. And so he's just sort of in a shift, right? And he takes the crown of thorns, holds it aloft, and crawls through the streets of Paris. The medieval streets of Paris, I should say. I wouldn't crawl through the streets of Paris today, but imagine doing it in the medieval period. It's
Right.
disgusting. So, so he crawls through the streets of Paris, and just showing his abject humility of this for this piece of this for this relic, and he builds for it a gigantic reliquary. Right, a reliquary is basically where you store relics or holy objects. So think, martyrs' bones or anything associated with Jesus's time on earth, and the crown of thorns is included. So he builds it, not a box to put it in. He builds it a chapel. He builds the Sainte-Chapelle, which you can go to Paris and visit today. And it was basically his personal chapel for him and his friends. And you had to be a pretty important pilgrim to get to come in. But he built it, and it's gorgeous, and it's dedicated to the crown of thorns. And by the time that was finished, so that's, what did he start at 1248 or something like that? Took about 20 years, which is astounding. By the time it's finished, the crown of thorns is everywhere in art. And that's about the time that we'll start to see it more and more, as you and I might understand it, with the sharp thorns, with the blood, with the cruelty, with the association more towards suffering, right? There's still a lot of the original associations of triumph, and of victory and things like that. But that's the moment when we start to see the crown of thorns as you and I would recognize it, definitely by the 13th century, and it's all because of Louis.
Fascinating. It's interesting, and I'm going to use almost like almost using a comics reference, how we see characters in comic books that we think have had all these things, but in truth, certain aspects came later, almost like with the iconography of Jesus. We've always thought that the crown of thorns was always part of the story, him always wearing it. But as you just said, Faith, that came much later in depictions, the suffering, the blood, the cruelty behind it. That is absolutely really incredible and really fascinating to really consider how different things would be if the crown of thorns was never depicted. And this is actually a fan question that actually one of my viewers actually wanted me to ask you for this discussion. And they wanted to know, looking on the research of the crown of thorns and iconography, how essential do you think it is to the overall history of Christianity and its early history, since it was never part of it to begin with? It was sort of just added into the lore, in a matter of speaking.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction between depicting the crown of thorns and knowing about the crown of thorns. So the depiction of the crown of thorns came very late, but that doesn't mean it wasn't something that people were aware of. So the crown of thorns actually plays a pretty big role theologically very early on, right? It's a representation of humiliation and the ideal of humbling oneself and suffering in order to gain the ultimate victory in heaven. So you think of Jesus, right? He suffered abject humiliation and suffering during the mockery and the crown of thorns, and it was all just sort of this almost pretext to his eventual victory, right, in heaven, his triumph, the resurrection, all of that.
Right.
And so you see that start to translate into martyrdom. So martyrs are people who die for their faith, right? And they were very popular because the Romans really enjoyed killing them in the 4th and 5th century. And so there were a lot of martyrs, and early Christians were really irritating to the Romans because they were willing to die for their faith. And they didn't quite compute that. The Romans didn't quite understand that. And so they would suffer. Usually they were often tortured or died in some horrible, humiliating way. They would die, and then they would receive a wreath or a crown in heaven as the ultimate victory. So the idea of the crown of thorns as a symbol of suffering, humiliation, and ultimate victory. These were the original ideas, and they stick through the understandings theologically in Christianity. So it's not that the crown of thorns just was sort of inserted later on. It was something that people knew about, but for reasons that the book goes into, it just wasn't depicted, right? You just don't
Right.
see it until it became incredibly important to depict that suffering to victory, right? It was important to depict that bridge between suffering and victory. That's when the crown of thorns really started showing up. So it's a very interesting question. The idea of sort of inserting this, and really the answer is that it was depicted because it meant something to very powerful people, right? And
Right.
that's what the book gets into when we talk about medieval kingship and the crown of thorns.
Absolutely. And speaking of kingship, this actually brings up another question one of my viewers asked, and I think it's actually a really very thought-provoking question. So it's a
Yeah.
very long one. I'm going to summarize it as best I can. So this
Okay.
viewer said that if you look at the depiction of, they actually did research into like the wreath crown, and they make the distinction or the argument that when we think of the wreath crowns during that period, during the late antiquities, a lot of us think of the crown wreaths that are depicted in Greek culture and Roman culture, of course, with the Caesars having either the golden wreath crown or just a regular wreath crown. And they
Mhm.
ask, is it possible that the wreath crown depictions have more Roman traits to it, as the Romans viewed that as a sign of kingship? And since Pontius Pilate was the overseer of the trial and the placing of the crown represented the king of the Jews, if we follow the story correctly, that the crown of thorns is not so much a part of Christian history as it is a continuation of the Roman traditions that were very prevalent during the time of Jesus.
Yeah, and it's actually something that I cover in the first part of the book, this idea of the wreath crown. And your listener is very astute because, and as I explain in the book, the wreath crown, or the crown that Jesus is given, is not a crown for a failed king, right? They're mocking him for his failure, as in our English translation, they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And of course, in the original Greek, he's called a basileus, right? And you can, of course, translate basileus into king, but basileus is really a leader, and there's very strong associations with the military in the term
Right.
basileus. And so, what the Romans were really mocking him for was his failure as a general. Right. And this goes back to the idea of what messiahs were in the first century. Right. Messiahs in the first century Judea were supposed to be these sort of militaristic leaders who were claimed that they were being sent by God to destroy the Romans and bring their people into new life. And the Roman soldiers, for better or worse, for right or wrong, put Jesus in that bucket of that kind of Messiah that they were used to dealing with. And these Messiah figures that you see throughout the first century are very militaristic. So they mock him not as a failed king, but as a failed basileus, as a failed general. So yes, they're absolutely right when they say that this is a Roman depiction. It's much closer to a Roman understanding of a wreath, because as I'm sure your listeners know, the Romans didn't have kings, right? They had
Right.
emperors. They got rid of their kings a long time ago, and no, we really don't have kings, we promise. But the Jews did, right? Judea did have a king, a client king. The client king had a boss, that was the emperor, right? And by the time of Jesus, in the first century, they didn't have one anymore. Right, they had a prefect, they had Pontius Pilate, they had a governor looking over much of the territory. So by then, the association with king is much more association with a leader, with a general. So yes, the
Mm.
crown that they're giving to Jesus is a Roman idea of generalship, rather than a Roman idea of kingship, because that wasn't quite as strong with the Romans as generalship would be. So it's a great question, a great observation.
You got it actually very, very interesting if you put in that regard, because again, I have not heard of that term, but I've done my own very little research into this, and it does make it a little bit more interesting when you look at it in that regard. If you think of it as, what the Romans did, they were mocking him not as, a king, but more of a generalship. And this actually is another question I want to ask you, Faith,
Mm.
is why is it that it's in the teachings and in the research that Jesus is the one that gets the wreath crown, as opposed to other figures in Jewish history who did rebel against the Romans in their own way, that were not given the crown, or there's no depiction of them with the crown in modern iconography?
Hmm. You mean other Messiah figures around this time?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is what's fascinating, and I've always found fascinating about first century Judea. We probably could have done this discussion just on first century Judea, but that's okay. I think it's a fascinating time period because we have so much information about the first century, especially, leading up to the Great Jewish Revolt and beyond that. That's in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple and Titus and
Hmm.
Vespasian and blah, blah, blah. And the reason we have so much information is because of a near contemporary historian named Josephus, and Philo a little bit, but mostly it's Josephus. And Tacitus, who is another Roman historian, he has one line about this time period, this same time period, Jesus' time period, first century, lead up to the revolt. Tacitus, who's a very renowned historian, even in his time, he said, in Judea, all was quiet. And yet, Josephus has a very different idea of Judea at this time. He goes on for pages and books and books and books and books about Judea. So the only reason that we know about any of these Messiah figures is because of Josephus. But what's
Mm.
interesting is that we have one more corroborating piece of literature, and it's accidental, and it's the
Ooh.
Gospels, right? The Gospels are accidentally historical, right? That's not the purpose of them. They're not Josephus. They're not writing history, right? They're sacred literature. The Christians believe that they are living sacred documents, right? But they are accidentally historical and accidentally corroborate a lot of what Josephus says. So the fact that we know what happened to Jesus and how he died is only because of the Gospels. We understand a lot about Jesus and the idea of messiahship because of Josephus and because he explains what messiahs are like throughout that time. But the reason we don't know exactly what happened to everyone is because Josephus just doesn't go into details, and not everyone got a
Mhm.
gospel written about them. Jesus was, well, he's the only one we still have, right?
Right.
Of the gospel. So we know a lot more detail about his death. And I have to say, a lot of these other messiahs die in battle, right? So they die because they're battling the Romans. They have some sort of ill-conceived battle plan that they think they're going to defeat the Romans. But as you and many of your
Doesn't
listeners
work.
know, the Romans meet insolence with violence, and they win pretty much every time, at least in Judea. So it's a very interesting question, and I think it's fascinating because we have so much information on this very specific time period because of only two sources, basically.
Yes, very true. And this is actually another question. This one I've actually been thinking about quite a lot, because it's actually for research in one of my uh, books that I'm writing in my fiction series, Tales from the Gathering. Now, for those that don't know, it's a little plug-in for that series. It's alternative history featuring characters from a different story of mine. but they begin in the 400 BC to 880. And there's one character and one time period which I'm looking at and doing research in, and it's what if Rome fell in 216 BC? How does that affect the rest of the world? If Rome loses the battle against Carthage in 216 BC, that affects a lot of future players. And one, of course, is the Christians in Jerusalem and the Levant region, in what we would later know today during the time of Pontius Pilate. And doing research, I was looking at a lot of historians who were arguing this, like, how different would the iconography of Jesus be if it was not the Romans, but the Parthians who would control that region? Would the Parthians have used a crown of thorns, or would they have used something else in their own teachings? How would that have changed? And I was researching this and trying to figure out, well, would the crown of thorns still existed if it wasn't the Romans but the Parthians? And in my research, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was none. There was nothing that at least I could find that corroborate if the Parthians were still in control of the Levant region, if they still controlled Jerusalem, that the crown of thorns would be used. So all the research that I have been uncovering is that the crown of thorns is synonymous, again, what we talked about, like with the Romanness of the persecution and the crucifixion, that there would be no crown of thorns if Rome was there, ultimately, which I found very, very fascinating. And then kind of going forward into it, as you're talking about, what we think of nowadays is just the imagery of the crown of thorns. Like, do you think, and I think you've probably mentioned this before, but maybe we can go in a different direction, that if there would be no crown of thorns, like if the crown of thorns as an iconography did not exist, let me phrase it, it existed, but there's no artistic depictions of it. We just see the crucifixion, but there's nothing on his head. How important of that as a research focal point is it to the overall study of Christian iconography and Judeo-Christian teachings if there was no crown of thorns, like, at all?
Well, I think iconography, I mean, because as I've said, it came very late to the game, right? So it took some time to get there, which is, of course, very interesting. So I'm not sure how much it really would have affected iconography early on, sort of in the medieval period, and even into the high medieval period. Certainly our understanding of Passion iconography, it almost seems that the Passion imagery is lacking something if it doesn't have a crown of thorns, right? So it probably would have affected that. But ultimately, if it had never been included, it never would have been included. But what's very interesting about that study of sort of, alternate history is that it's important to keep in mind that the Levant was also very influenced by other forces, especially the Greeks. Right, the Greeks had huge influence, and they had a huge wreath culture. So I might not be totally convinced that he wouldn't have been given a wreath of some kind, because there is such a huge wreath culture in the region at all. And the other thing to consider too is that Judea and the Jews were almost a tourist destination for Romans because they were so ancient. Right, them and the Egyptians, right? They have been in the area for a long, long, long time, and they were an ancient culture, which is why they got some dispensation from the Romans in at all, because they were such an ancient culture. And so I think those are two interesting things to think about. Not because it would necessarily change that the crown of thorns didn't exist, but that this idea of wreaths can go back much, much, much farther than the Romans, and the Romans are borrowing it from others, right? And I
Yeah.
don't really know about the Parthians, Carthaginians, how much wreath culture that they had, but it is important to remember that the area that we're talking about is relatively small, right? And that
Mhm.
the influence of the Greeks was very strong, especially for the Romans. But it's an interesting question. I think for the modern viewer, again, I'm surprised the Crown of Thorns was depicted at all, because for so long it's not. Right, and it's looking at why it was depicted when it was depicted. So if the Crown of Thorns didn't exist, I'm not sure it would have affected the iconography too much, only because it took about 700 years for it to come to the fore at all.
Right. Of course. And this actually brings up another thing which I want to talk to you about. And this actually is from a viewer who watched my other earliest interview with another great historian. She is a doctor of Coptic Christian teachings of the Byzantines. And this person asks if there's any depictions. I don't know if you may have uncovered this in your research, but if there are any depictions or references of the crown of thorns in Coptic Christian teachings or Eastern Orthodox traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Byzantines.
I do have a chapter on this. So your viewer is very welcome to pick up a copy. One of the interesting things is that there is very little Byzantine influence for the Crown of Thorns. We have
Mm,
some depictions of the mockery, but they're very rare, and they're just not very relevant or prevalent. And we don't really have any crown of thorns, which is really interesting to me, because the crown of thorns did exist in the Holy Land and eventually made its way to Constantinople as a relic. And so it's fascinating to me that even the idea of the relic didn't really influence the art until much, much later. And that's not to say that the Coptic imagery didn't include wreaths. I think it probably did. I don't know much about it. Your professor of Coptic Christianity will be much better to answer that question. But I do think there probably are wreaths included in the imagery, but not necessarily in association with the crown of thorns. Possibly more associated with things like victory and triumph.
right. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. I'll have to ask her that when I next see her. She's probably on vacation for the holidays. Now, Dr. Tibble, we're going to go back to something that you actually brought up earlier in the discussion, and that is, of course, how do we view the Crown of Thorns now in the modern day? And I was wondering if you can go a little bit more in depth as almost what your publisher said, like why this chapter is essential to the overall research and discussion of the Crown of Thorns.
I think it's essential, because it's sort of, if without that chapter, it sort of leaves us wondering, well, do these ideas persist, right? And by these ideas, I mean the idea of the crown of thorns is very heavily associated in the medieval era and late antiquity. The early Christians saw the crown of thorns as this, as we were talking about earlier, is this idea of humility, of suffering in order to gain victory. It's seen as an association with kingship, and gaining ultimate triumph, right? And these ideas really persist into the medieval period, especially with the kings, right? They see it as their role as kings to imitate Christ. And one of the key
Mm-hmm.
ways that they imitate Christ is by being humiliated and eventually triumphing in the greatest earthly throne. Right, that this
Right.
idea of Christomimesis is the word, and so it was important to talk about, do these ideas that were so deeply ingrained in the early Christian and medieval world, do they persist into our own understanding of the Crown of Thorns? Because I think when you walk through the halls of our esteemed museums throughout the world, really, and you look at this imagery, this iconography of Christ and his passion and his crown of thorns, you think of cruelty, of death, of suffering. So I was curious, and so were the publishers, to see, do these ideas from the medieval world persist into the modern? And my thinking going into it was, nah, they can't, can they? Maybe not. And I was shocked at how almost exactly these ideas persist in art, in literature, in film. And that's what the chapter is about.
Nice. It's almost, in a sense, it's trying to invoke an emotional response, which it does, because if you see it, you know that it is supposed to be uncomfortable. You know it's supposed to be very, very disheartening. As you mentioned, in the modern art depictions that we have of the crown of thorns and of the crucifixion, it is one of death, one of suffering, one of misery and pain, and probably the most graphic depiction of the crown of thorns that we've seen in recent media is The Passion of the Christ, directed by Mel Gibson. You have had other stories that have focused on the life and death of Jesus in the 70s and 80s. And yes, The Crown of Thorns was heavily present in those films. And while those had a more, what's the word I'm thinking of? I don't want to say tamed down, because depending on who you show that film to, it could be very, very graphic. But the response is more of like very sorrow and very saddened. Whereas the Passion of the Christ, in that depiction, it is an intense, brutal, raw. It is in your face. So I'm very intrigued that those emotions that you had found in the medieval age transitioned over into the modern age. And it's just so incredibly fascinating, like how ingrained that moment is, that scene is in our minds. And I'm just blown away by it.
Yeah, and the Passion of the Christ is the example that I actually use in the book for the film section,
Mm,
because it's something that a lot of people have seen, and I think it was one of those films that was met with equal measures of awe and ire, because it is so violent, and it's shockingly violent for the topic that it's discussing to our modern eye. But it's also cinematically gorgeous. The use of Aramaic and Latin is extraordinary. It's a fascinating film. It's almost, you can't look away. It's one of those films. And I have to say that the violence that you encounter in that film is incredibly accurate, right? The
mm.
Romans were cruel tormentors, right? When they punished someone, it was
Oh yes.
public and memorable, right? And so
Mhm.
that was the whole point of punishment, and especially of criminals, in the provinces. So when we see the Passion of the Christ, it's shocking. But that scene of the mockery, I mean, first you have to get through the flagellations, which is really, really hard to watch. But
Yes,
after the
yes.
flagellation, you get this scene of, it's almost a triple split scene. I don't know the film term for that, but you have Jesus being mocked, right? So you have the fashioning of the crown, you have the cloak, you have the Roman sort of pressing it. You have the sound effects of the thorns going into his head. It's awful. And then you also are split to the women, right? Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, and sort of washing the blood from the flagellation. And then you also have another scene that keeps splitting between these, right? You have one more scene that goes much farther back. And it's the scene is, you have a bunch of sort of, sort of the elite Jewish community, and they are holding stones, right? And Jesus bends down and writes in the sand. And the men, they sort of drop their stones, walk away. And a woman, the same woman, Mary Magdalene, who's cleaning the blood and watching the mockery happen, reaches out her hands. She's curled up, in the sand, humiliated, deeply humiliated. Reaches out to Jesus to touch his feet, and he raises her up. Right, the scene that we're seeing that happened in the past is it's kind of a conflation of a couple of stories, but it's the scene of the woman who's caught in adultery, who in the Gospels wasn't necessarily Mary Magdalene, but that's the conflation that they're making. And it's this, I think, one of the most incredibly poignant scenes in the Gospels. But there's a woman who's taken before Jesus who's been caught in the act of adultery, right? And in Jewish law, she should be stoned to death, right? Deeply humiliating, to be caught in the act of adultery, and of course then to be publicly stoned takes a while. It's very, very humiliating, very, very painful, lots of suffering. And so they say to Jesus, you're a rabbi, you're a learned man, and obviously we're here to challenge you. What should we do with this woman? Right? The law says we should stone her. Jesus sort of writes in the sand. Some people say he writes something in the sand. I think he's probably just taking his time to think. And he stands up and he says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." And they all walk away because none of them are without sin, right? None of them have never not done something wrong. They just didn't get caught. And so the woman is then brought from this deep, deep humiliation and suffering. She is brought out of what was already humiliating. She's already lost her position. She's already lost her family, and she was about to be stoned to death publicly. She's been raised up, literally and figuratively, raised up out of this humiliation, this torture, this suffering, to life. She was saved, right? So you have this parallel of the story of Jesus saving someone from deep humiliation while he is experiencing deep humiliation himself, that will lead to ultimate victory, right? All of these ideas that I've just talked about are early Christian medieval ideas. The idea of deep humiliation leading to salvation, leading to triumph, right? So we see it in this very modern, actually, I don't know how modern it is anymore, but this very modern movie of Jesus and his passion and the crown of thorns and the mockery, and that actually it's juxtaposed with this idea of humiliation and triumph. It's fascinating. It's fascinating that this idea still permeates in our head.
Very true. Very true. And I think I've only seen bits and pieces of that movie because I couldn't watch all of it because it is, as we've talked about, a very intense movie, a very beautifully directed movie, but an intense movie nonetheless. And this discussion is very fascinating for me, Dr. Tibble, because it brings up a discussion that we don't really talk about as much in a lot of historiographical teachings or research, and don't really consider, how does this artifact impact the historical scholarship, the discussion moving forward of what this piece means to the overall history of not only Western European religious faith, but also art, Western art and its depictions, cultural history, and so forth. So I guess as a final note on this amazing discussion, could you argue, Dr. Tibble, that if you were to look at the Crown of Thorns purely from a research standpoint, that the Crown of Thorns is a fulcrum, a focal point, which can be used to look at so many different avenues, as we talked about, from art depictions, cultural history, political history, Western European history, and of course, Jewish history, Judeo-Christian teachings and religion, and so forth. That it is probably among many things in history, one of very few pieces, physical pieces, that could be jumping points for so many discussions.
Gabriel, brilliantly put. I think yes to all of that. I think you really hit the nail on the head about this really alarmingly, shockingly, that this one small item can be a focal point for so much, right? It allows us to dive really deeply into first century Judean history, into Roman history, into military history. It allows us to look at early Christianity when it was just this nascent cult, right? It allows us to understand their psyche. It allows us to understand how they were interpreting their God, right? Their new God. It allows us to look at how the medieval world sort of crawled its way out of late antiquity and blossomed into this most incredible states of kingship and how they interpret their relationship with Christ. It allows us to look at theologically, from the standpoint, the Crown of Thorns lets us look very deeply into the understanding of ideas of humiliation, suffering, and triumph. And it also allows us to look even further into our own psyche, into our own understanding of how we see suffering on the walls of our museum, how it affects us in our daily life, and how we associate suffering with success, right? And it's all of these ideas coming together from a single object that took 700 years to come to the fore. And I think it's what you say is absolutely true. And it's really exciting when we can find things as historians, when we find these focal points, to be able to talk about all of these different facets of history, right? Because this isn't just for the theologians, this isn't just for the art historians, this isn't just for the military historians. Everyone can get in on this. Right. And that's what I love about this topic and about so many topics that I'm sure you discuss with other people is being able to reach different audiences and pull more people into the historian family.
Absolutely, Dr. Tibble. Absolutely. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude officially season 3 of the Historians Lounge here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to my good friend, Dr. Faith Tibble, for coming back on the show. Faith, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I really do appreciate it. Now, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and connect? Where can people buy a copy of your book? And do you have any special announcements you'd like to share for the new year? Any speakings or discussions or seminars you're going to be a part of for the new year?
All good questions. So you can find me on Instagram on Dr. Faith Tibble. You can find me on you can find me on Blue Sky under Faith Tibble. And I think those are the two big ones that I use. And of course, X, you can find me as Faith Tibble. And you can find the Crown of Thorns on the Bloomsbury website. It's TNT Clark Bloomsbury. So head to the website and just type in Faith Tibble and it will come up. You can also find me on Amazon UK and US. And for the coming year, I'll be doing a couple of talks here and there. I think in a cathedral in March, and I'm not sure about any of them online, but you'll see them come up on if you follow me on Instagram or X, you'll see them come up.
Nice. I will link all that down below in the description of the video, viewers and listeners. Thank you again so much for joining us for season 3 of the Historians Lounge. Be on the lookout for my announcement for season 4 of the Historians Lounge, which will be beginning sometime in the new year. And as always, a huge thank you to my good friend, Dr. Faith Tibble, for coming back on the show. Always a pleasure having her. And if you want to follow her, make sure to follow her on all of her social media, as I will list that down below in the description of this video. And if you want to see her first interview, where we talk about her book in great detail, as well as her background as an historian, I will tag it right here for you to watch. And until next time, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with all the episodes coming out later this month. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful morning wherever you are in the world. Happy holidays, everyone. and we'll see you all in the next episode.